Hello and welcome to the Pieces in Action Verb podcast. I'm here with Jennifer Browdy, who is an author and a teacher. And I also have noticed, Jennifer, you are an artist. I see you posting your own drawings and photography. And I'm going to throw in there that you're a horse lover as well, and somebody who not only tells stories yourself, but you help other people tell stories, and that's part of your healing work here. And so with that very simple introduction, I'd like to turn it over to you to tell us more about who you are.
Okay, well, thank you. I'm this podcast appeals to me because I think I'm a very peaceful person. I think I always have been. I always seek out peace and run from conflict. I'm not very good at conflict. And when I was little, that took the form of going out in the woods by myself. I was very lucky to be in a place where I could do that. And I was very, very young. I must have been 6 or so. And I had a special spot out in the woods. And I would go out there, and as I got a little older and I could write, I would bring my notebook out with me to this little special spot. It was like a ring of stones with grass in the middle and trees all around. And I would write. And so one of the first stories that I wrote at that time in my childhood was I was very concerned about the cutting of the trees, and this intersects with our common interest in tree sisters.
That's right.
Yeah, I came. It was just a simple thing that, as an adult we don't pay attention to, but they were cutting the trees under the power lines.
So near your home, near your special spot.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And it happened to be spring, and all they had just decapitated a line of trees, and all the new buds were just dying, and all, there's like sap oozing up and going nowhere because they had cut the trees. It was very upsetting to me. And I started to write a story about a wood nymph named Estrella, which I don't know how I even knew that word because I didn't know Spanish yet, but that means star in Spanish.
Right.
And Spanish later became important for me. And so she was trying to gather the animals of the forest together to figure out a way to save the forest. And this is like before I had read Narnia, before I had read Tolkien. It just came out of nowhere for me.
How old were you at that point?
I was about 8.
Okay, so you were at the point where your writing skills were enough that you could piece together a storyline, basically. So
yeah, I wrote in pencil in a notebook,
Yeah.
And so I wrote that story, and I carried it through several chapters, and then I got to this point where they were setting off on a quest to save the forest, and I couldn't really go any further because I couldn't imagine how they could do it. I couldn't imagine the solution.
Can I back you up for a moment or two just to
Sure.
notice some peace happening here? Mm-hmm. So to start off with, this is a podcast about verbs, and yet somehow we have to also include some nouns. And so I'm going to mention the trees and the stones and the walking, the your being able to go to a place that was natural, that was imbued with spirit, is what I am just knowing about how that must have been. And then so there you are, you're returning. So there's an action there. You're returning again and again to this place, spending time in this place, being a part of this place. And then with that deep connection you have, you are very much aware of the wounding to the surroundings of the place, to the forest. And then your response is to sense the wood nymph spirit, and her name being Estrella. And then I'm hearing you say you had several chapters coming out of you. And so this act of storytelling, which I believe to be a very sacred piece verb, is, can you, as an author, as a storyteller who at age 8 brought forth chapters, is that a listening process you're doing internally? What is it that allows for a story to come through you in that kind of a way? I believe there was an intention setting you had. You had a deep wish to help. You had a deep wish to bring forward some kind of healing. So it must have started with that. But do you know where this comes from?
I've been wondering. I mean, so I told that story in the memoir that I wrote. And the thing about the memoir that was interesting is I had completely forgotten that story. And that notebook was in a box somewhere in my parents' attic. You know, I hadn't looked at it in many years. And as I was writing the memoir and starting to remember my childhood, all of a sudden I remembered that wood nymph, Estrella, and her name and how I pictured her. And I realized that she was still out there in the forest. She was still waiting for me to like get with it and help her save the forest. And so there was a real urgency there. So I feel like she showed up in my childhood and she's still with me now. Yeah.
So I'm hearing you say the story is coming through you. You're collecting the story, and you're walking down the path with this story, with the collection of the beings of the forest to save the forest, and then you get to a halt. You can't imagine how that saving is going to happen. And then Estrella doesn't leave you. She stays with you all these many years later, and she's around you, calling to you again. Jennifer, we need to pick up the storytelling again. So I think that's actually a really fun introduction into what I understand you to be doing and up to lately. So how does that storytelling help create the solutions, bring them into being?
Yeah, well, for a long time I was focused on stories of women writing resistance, is what I called it. I have a couple of anthologies, Women Writing Resistance in Latin America and Africa and the Caribbean. And what I realized in writing the memoir is that it's not enough just to be in resistance to something. You have to be for something. You know, you have to know what you want, really. And so I have shifted now towards helping people envision what it is they want. So my latest book, Purposeful Memoir as a Path to a Thriving Future, is really about the future. It's looking back in order to envision more intentionally the future we need. And so I feel like there's, Estrella in a way is calling to me from the future that we want.
Oh my goodness. Wow. Yeah. So there's weaving of time. There's weaving of time, which is, I think we have to somehow add that to the list of peace verbs of a looking backward and a looking forward. And in looking backward, I'm sure that we collect things that have been wonderful and we want to see more of, and also things that have been sorrowful and that we want to see less of, or that we want to halt or we want to redirect. And so the resistance, your time spent with focusing on resistance as a peace action with women as peace actors in different parts of the world, and now you're moving towards an envisioning. And so I'm sure that awareness of the resistance is also an important component of leading towards, well, if I don't want that, what do I want?
Exactly. Yeah. So I coined this word, world rights. And that is a word that came from the word playwright.
Oh.
So playwrights write plays, and world rights, right to write the world, right to make the world better. And that's a title of a course that I've been teaching for a long time. Women Write the World, with a double entendre of right and right, you know.
So I'm sorry. I just want to pause with this for a moment. And so we go to plays to be in an audience and see a story that has a story arc, and that there's some sort of deep healing that can happen in that observing of or witnessing of a story in a physical present kind of a way. So there's somehow a difference between seeing a play and watching a movie or even reading a book. And so you're not saying novel writing as your way to formulate this course. You're saying playwriting, and then world writing. And so I'm noticing the embodied difference between
Mm.
like a screenplay versus, a play that's written. So thank you. So you're moving into this course.
Yeah. Well, I actually welcome any kind of writing. I think all writing that is positive in intention does make the world better.
Hmm.
And so, with my students, certainly my college age students, one of the problems we have now is that it can be really hard to envision a positive future, and we
Yeah.
are constantly bombarded with dystopian imaginings, whether fictional or just in the news.
Right. Right.
So I think especially for young people and really for everybody, it's important to counter those dystopian visions with, imagining what could be.
Mm-hmm.
It's very important. And that, from that initial imagining, we can build the bridges towards that future. If we can't imagine it, we can't create it.
And so
So,
you've got Estrella calling you forward, calling
yeah.
you towards the future.
Mm-hmm.
Does she give you any really specific directives, or is it more just a general sense of her presence calling you forward?
She's it's like a potential that she is, and it's a vision of harmony, really, with the earth, and sort of the earth as a spiritual being. So I think a lot about Gaia and the Gaia hypothesis, and human beings as kind of the connector of spirit and matter,
Hmm.
and and our imaginations as being key, really key. So I'm kind of Jungian in that. And I'm currently writing a book about education for the 21st century, and thinking about, it's one of these, it's not even a problem. It's a circumstance that it's so common we don't notice it, but people, and especially young people, are forgetting how to daydream.
Right.
Because all of their time is so occupied with consuming other people's imaginings, and other people's ideas, and they just don't give themselves the time to daydream, space out, and even their sleep can be very disrupted. So even the nighttime dreams is a problem. So I think this is having profound consequences. And the first thing to do about any problem is simply to name it. So that's pretty much where I am. I don't know what to do about it, but I see that it's a problem. And so part of what was so special for me in my childhood was that space. Who knows what I did in that little circle of stones? I just sat there and I just watched and I just communed, and then later I began to write.
Before you were writing, you probably went on little adventures in your own imagination, wouldn't you think?
I was very observant. I noticed if there were birds or there were insects, or I noticed the wildflowers. But yeah, just this sort of act of spacing out. It doesn't always have to have a goal. It doesn't have to be, we don't have to be productive all the time. It's about being rather than doing.
And so there's a piece verb right there, right?
Yeah, right. Mm-hmm. Being.
And that could be being still, being in motion, but being in a way that is not with an end goal in sight or without a whole lot of thought attached to it, but some sort of communion with the present.
Yeah, and opening yourself up to be a channel for whatever communication may be available. So, if I hadn't just been sitting there listening, I wouldn't have heard Estrella,
Right.
And I have to say that when I was writing my memoir, I really needed her. I needed her. And so she came. That guidance was really important. Much later, decades later.
And how interesting, like you talk about her pulling you forward to the future now as a potential of healing and light. So what is an Estrella? It's a star. Estrella
Mm-hmm.
is a star. And
Mm-hmm.
she was also giving you a certain clue towards your future to involve Latin America and Spanish.
Yeah. Yeah. I ended up learning Spanish and studying Spanish literature, and Spanish was one of my degree is in comparative literature. So for
Hmm.
the PhD in comparative literature, you have to have three languages besides English.
Oh, wow.
I Spanish was one, French the other, and then German. Um, so it became important, and then I married a man from Mexico. So my children are part Mexican, and I spent a lot of time there. So yeah, it became important.
And somehow, from the very little of Spanish or the Spanish literature or Latin American literature that I've been exposed to, magical realism is very important. And
Hmm.
so,
Hmm.
can you tell us a little bit about what magical realism is?
Well, magical realism is sort of entertaining the idea that there can still be magic in ordinary life. So it's um, realist in that it's everyday, ordinary life, but then suddenly something magic happens. And
Seamlessly, right? So the narrative is looking very familiar with things that we see with our physical eyes, and then all of a sudden something happens that is
magical.
extraordinary. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah.
Yeah. So I actually, I have, of course, I've read magic realism, and you know, I know what it is, but it's not what I've really been drawn to
Hmm.
in Latin American literature. I have been most drawn to indigenous narratives, very marginal narratives that might not make it into the mainstream, that most people wouldn't have heard of. Those are the ones that I was drawn to study.
And
Um,
so you were seeking and following. Right now I'm looking at the peace wall, but so there's finding and following your own path,
mm-hmm,
and that includes seeking. It includes learning with your heart and your mind. It includes delving. I think anybody with a PhD has delved.
mm-hmm. Yeah, yeah. Um, you have to. It was interesting. My PhD in comparative literature, which is a kind of newer field than English. I mean, I discovered that I started in English and then discovered that in English literature you can only study works written in English
Hmm.
at the doctoral level, and
Sure.
that was very limiting to me. So that's why I went into comparative literature, and then within that, there were also limits and boundaries that I wasn't happy with. So I wanted to study personal narratives, memoirs, and autobiographies by people from the Americas,
Hmm.
North America all the way to South America and Central America, the whole and Caribbean. And it wasn't done at the time. Like that was too comparative for my advisors at the time. So I had to fight and argue to
Wow.
be able to, make that regional focus my area of interest.
So you were feeling a calling, following the calling, carving out space for yourself,
Mm-hmm.
fighting for your path to be allowed and also accredited and
Yeah.
honored with the degree. And in
Mm-hmm.
that you're also listening. You're seeking and listening in a very important way, and by doing so it feels to me like you're also creating a conduit for those voices to travel further.
Yeah, that was my hope. And that was what as I began teaching, those were the voices I was introducing my students to.
Wow.
Um,
So you are, in a sense, being a human ampliphone or
mhm,
a
mhm,
broadcasting tower,
mhm.
and
Yeah.
in a way that you can also interpret, because you're telling me with comparative literature you have to be fluent in three additional languages, and so you are also a linguist. And so there's there's the mind expansion that you've experienced by having different grammar structures and different sounds of words. And even just like I'm thinking German versus Spanish versus French, English, like what different shapes the mouth and the throat and the lungs make, and
Mm-hmm.
how the words don't really mean the same thing. You can translate from the word to listen into all those different languages, and the sound of that, the shape of that word is so different.
Mm-hmm.
And so, did you learn some indigenous languages, or how did that work for you when you were reading the memoirs? Did you?
Yeah. No, I don't know indigenous languages, but so I relied on Spanish translations of indigenous languages.
Right.
And um, it's very interesting to think about certain concepts that really can't be thought in one language versus another.
Yeah.
That's why it's so important to save languages like indigenous languages that almost went extinct and have gone extinct in many cases. Yeah, so I've been drawn to indigenous ways of knowing, and there have been, I think my early sense of being a part of the earth community in my backyard in this little forest that I went to has persisted
Hmm.
and grown stronger even. And I feel like we're all being called now
We
to, I
are.
mean,
We
climate change
absolutely.
is just it's a huge wake up call for everybody. And for me, the call came earlier than for many. So I would say back around 2010,
Mm-hmm.
I became very, very aware and very disturbed by the trajectory of climate change and what might happen to in terms of political disruption, social disruption. I became worried about it, and so I started a blog. My way of dealing with worry is always to write.
Mm-hmm.
So, and I didn't at that time. I was teaching more narratives of social justice and not as much environmental justice.
Hmm.
And between 2010 and let's say 2020, I began to merge those and understand how closely they're merged. Like you can't have one
It's,
without the other.
it's all the same.
Yeah. And so, but the blog was called Transition Times, and it was about being in this transitionary time where things could go either way. It just was so uncertain which way we would go. And it was really helpful to do that because the blog was like a sandbox for me. I could just sort of try out ideas and, not have to be as formal as you are pushed to be in academia.
Hmm.
Um,
Right.
and I got, those were kind of early days of blogging and the internet, and I was excited by the connections that I was making. It was before before a lot of the social media had really developed. So it was good. It was good. I think one of the most important things, and this might be a piece for, is connecting.
Oh, for
And
sure. I'm going to write
yeah,
that down because I'm not even sure that's on my list yet. Connecting.
yeah, and so finding kindred spirits and connecting, and that is it's getting easier to do, because of the internet, like what we're doing here.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. I mean, exactly, because we met in a online community, and so then I could become aware of you through how you present yourself, through your photos, through your little snippets of storyline, and
Right.
then invite you. So it is remarkable how small the world is becoming in that way.
Yeah, it's exciting. So I have, well, like everybody with the pandemic, I started teaching online,
Mm.
and I actually really enjoy teaching online because I get to meet people from all over the place. So it releases me from geographic limitations.
Hmm. Hmm.
It's exciting.
It is exciting, and see. First, I just want to check in on the timer, Jennifer, because I started it a little bit late. So I say we have about 25 minutes left. Does that seem about right to you? Okay.
Sure.
Um, so in addition to the storytelling as a peace verb and spending time with trees, spending time with rocks, spending time with blades of grass, with insects that I've heard you talking about, spending time with the spirits of these places, Estrella being a wood nymph and a star.
Mm-hmm.
I also happen to be aware that you spend time with horses.
Mm-hmm.
Can you tell us a little bit about that relationship and the peace that comes from spending time with horses?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Well, I was like many adolescent girls, really drawn to horses at that time, and I did as much riding as I could as a teenager, but not as much as I wanted to. And then I left it for a long time, and so I got back to horses when my younger son left for college, and I was an empty nester, and I was like, well, now what am I going to do? That was what I really wanted to do. Was the need to connect with horses was really right there. So I started very gently, and I wasn't, I started as a beginner. And what I found was the horses were so welcoming. The horses really, one of the good things about horses is that they meet you where you are.
So
Which is
that's
something, yeah.
so just to pause in a moment with that peace verb, to welcome is
Mm-hmm.
inherently connected to meeting someone where they are.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I try to do that as a teacher. I try to meet people where they are, and if I don't understand where they are or I don't agree with where they are, I still want to try to understand and move along together and learn together. And so that's what I felt the horses were doing with me.
And quite literally moving along together, because if you're on their back, you're and they're meeting you where you are, and then you move along
Yeah.
together.
Yeah, I guess I was fortunate to have very kind horses who I was a beginner. And the other thing that really was wonderful about getting back to horseback riding at that moment was I had been we haven't mentioned this yet, but I founded and directed a pretty major program, a conference, and an annual conference that grew into a month-long festival that grew into year-round programming. And
Oh my goodness.
I was doing all that while doing my full-time teaching and mothering and everything else. And I was very tired. I was very
I can imagine. Yeah.
And so one of the wonderful things about going back to riding was simply kind of letting go and not having a goal. So I didn't know, I wasn't riding so I could prepare to be in a show or, I just wanted to ride. That's it. And not have a goal. And that was really liberating for me. And
so it was sorry to interrupt you. It was a return to a behavior and a knowingness that you had as a young person. And so the letting go into the beingness and the connection with other beings who are not humans as an aspect of that, and the going, when you're riding a horse, you're always going somewhere, whether it's in a circle from one place and then back to the barn and stable, you're still going somewhere, and yet there's a stillness and a present moment of that, of just being.
Well, it was also I'm spend a lot of time in my head. I'm an intellectual kind of person. So with horses, that's completely beside the point. It's all about the body and the heart and sort of connecting in a non-verbal way. And it's about balance.
About balance. So I hear people who ride horses and spend time with horses, care for horses, that horses have huge, like quite literally, physically huge hearts, but also spiritually huge hearts. And so to be in your heart, is that a physical experience? Is that, I mean, do you feel it here? Do you feel it in your chest area?
Yeah.
Are you noticing the connection and the energy flowing?
Well, it's an amazing feeling. I mean, it's about alignment, so balance.
Mm.
And when it's going well, there's this alignment of the chakras. You know, it's like
Mm.
right, and that goes right into the horse. You know, and the
Wow.
horse
Oh my
can
goodness.
feel everything. You know, any lack of alignment, the horse feels it immediately. You know,
Yeah.
so
So they're
um,
they're they're in a sense they're providing like an energetic mentorship to their human
yeah,
partners of like, okay, I'm an aligned being, I'm horse, I'm aligned, here human, you can line up with me and we can move together.
yeah, yeah. It's really something. And I in Iceland, you know, I just got back from Iceland and I did some riding there. And the Icelandic horses are unique in that they talt, which is a pace.
So it's different
So
than a trot. Is it different than walk, trot,
it
lope,
is
gallop, or I
cancer,
can't?
cancer.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, trotting is, you know, a four beat gait and it's kind of bumpy and you have to post. And the talt is the two sides of the horse move together and you
Wow.
just sit it. It's very, very smooth. And
Wow.
so you feel the alignment even more because you're just really sitting there moving and the horse is moving on either side of you. It must have something to do with the, you know, the brain, the two sides of the brain. Everything seems to align. Yeah.
I'm in awe of this. I rode horses in summer camp as a I don't know 9 to 13 year old kid.
Mhm.
So that's my exposure. Very very brief. And so I'm marveling that there's an inherent rhythm. There's like a drum beat, which is like a heartbeat. There's a breathing.
Yeah.
I noticed that to walk as a biped being is also a
Mhm.
piece verb, and
Mhm.
yet somehow when you add two more legs, and that
Yeah.
you're now holding on to another being that is using four legs, and that they have different options for the rhythm and syncopation of that, and even how they're moving themselves forward, going from side to side. So I'm
Mhm.
I'm feeling and also hearing what you're saying, just
Mhm.
marveling.
Mhm. Yeah. And they, you know, like all animals, they are much more perceptive than we are. So, you know, they're noticing all kinds of things that we probably don't. And so sometimes they spook, and you know, sometimes they. I actually broke 5 ribs last winter because my horse spooked, and
That's a
I
lot of ribs, Jennifer.
I came
Wow.
off. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, and that was an interesting experience. It was the first time I ever broke any bones in my life, and
And ribs are hard bones to heal. I mean,
your
they're,
ribs are. Yeah,
yeah,
I took them for granted, you know, and um,
yeah.
so it was helpful. I thought it was definitely an interesting learning experience to heal, to break the ribs, to heal from the ribs, to get back on the horse. You know, it was
So there's
overall it was good.
that that expression of getting back into the saddle, and so
Hmm.
few of us actually viscerally understand what that means.
Right, right. And you know, to know that the horse was it was totally justified in spooking. You know, it was I wasn't there was no blame involved. Um, I just couldn't stay on.
Wow, and I mean, even that is a life lesson, right? The horse was totally justified in spooking, and you couldn't stay on. And so, if we
Hmm.
think about that as an analogy to other relationships, and
Mm.
and how we navigate the interconnectedness of relationship.
Mhm. Mhm. Yeah. True. Yeah, so I hope that there will be many more horses in my futures. I feel like I'm just beginning
Mm,
that new road,
mm,
and that's I mean I think that's something to remark on is starting new things. You
mm.
know,
That's a piece verb.
continuing,
Okay,
yeah,
you're
continuing
adding
to
to my
grow,
list.
continuing to
Yeah,
grow your or nourish your growing edge. I think it's really important, and
nourish your growing edge,
yeah,
and to
um,
acknowledge that we all have growing edges.
yeah. And yeah, I get the sense that you're doing that with your work now.
Oh
Yeah.
my goodness, yeah, and so there's. I mean, it's an interesting. thank you for sharing your experience with Australia, because it's just so true. And I mean, I experienced that too. So you've got this story as we envision our life out a few steps ahead of where we actually are in our life. And then we get to these moments where, oh, wait, I can't see any past this point. And there's something about allowing for that and having peace with that, that there's an ability to see out a certain distance and maybe not past that. And yet to nourish the growing edge is to allow that to continue to expand. And somehow these moments of pause, of connection with living beings other than ourselves, it is a deeply necessary component of that. And other humans who are less disconnected from that inherent understanding of how to do that, which I think when you seek out indigenous peoples, and indigenous just means people that haven't left their home, their ancestral land, right? So there's a continuity that we discover, we learn from our brothers and sisters who haven't left their homeland so much about the listening. And you're talking about horses having more perception than we have. I'm sure that indigenous peoples have more perception than those of us that have been disconnected from that continuity. And when I have these conversations, I tend to bring along a stone person or two. So I've got, yeah, got some friends here with me, and your crystal there. Wow. So you're connecting with horses. You just got back from, you said Greenland, Iceland. I'm sorry, Iceland.
Yeah.
And you not only are a writer, but you're also a photographer, and you are also a photographer. I believe we're seeing a photograph of yours in the background right here with you. So I notice a lot of images of water, light on water, sky, light dancing in the sky. Do you want to tell us a little bit more about that?
Well, those are the image that you see on the screen is Nova Scotia, and most of my photos of water and light on water come from Nova Scotia. And well, in my memoir, I hit upon the elements as a way of organizing life experience. So earth being the ground of our being, childhood, water being the teenage, young adult years where we join the stream of our time and place, and either we go with the flow or we start to sputter and try to find a different, tributary. Fire being the trials and tribulations that we face at any stage of life, and also our passions, and then air being the space of reflection on all of this. So I used that in my memoir, and the writing and the photographing kind of went hand in hand and became more intentional as the years have gone by. I just really like to try to capture beauty and share it.
And so there's a noticing, there's a stillness, an inner stillness, and an outward awareness that you bring to that.
Yeah, I don't know. My people will say, I was looking at the same thing, but I didn't see it. I didn't see that. Somehow, the framing matters. How you frame the image. And I've always been good at that. I started again when I was 8 or 9 years old. I got my first camera, and I started taking pictures just of nature. That was all I was interested in, and my dog. And then I studied photography in school. I learned film developing, and back in the day. Then I was a newspaper photographer for a while.
Oh, no kidding.
So I did a lot of newspaper type, small town newspaper shots of things, and that was still film. And then again, I kind of let it go and really dove all into words. I was all about words for a good 20 years or so. and then found my way back to the photograph. Yeah, and of course now the cameras are so good; they're so wonderful. So,
And ubiquitous, right? We all have
yeah,
access to
on the
high
phone.
quality, yeah, high quality
Yeah,
camera that doesn't even require that development stage.
right. So that is an interest. Just and the thread is seeing beauty, wanting to capture it, and then wanting to share it. That's it. And I think that's another piece action there. And
It
it
is.
has to do with what I was saying earlier about dystopias. Like we
Right.
also see a lot of images of just violence and ugliness of all kinds, and I want to counter that with images of beauty. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank
Hmm.
you.
Yeah. Um,
And I feel like we have such power in this time to be our own media. And so you're talking about your journey. You spent time in the newspaper industry
hmm hmm
back when, you and I are probably about the same age. We that was the window into the world.
Yeah.
Newspapers,
Yeah.
television,
hmm
and movies. And so here we are now where we can all be a journalist. We can all reflect back to each other images of our world and how much power there is in the intentionality, in the intention of saying, I wish to capture beauty. I'm going to pause and notice, and I am going to frame, and I am going to capture and share.
hmm hmm Yeah. Yeah. I kind of made a decision early on with sharing on social media that it was okay that I might lose control of my photo. My photo
Mm,
would just be out
mm,
in the internet,
mm,
um, because that meant I feel like I guess it's such a capitalist thing to try to have intellectual property and control it. I just want to release it. It
mm,
wasn't mine to begin with. The beauty was just there.
mm.
Nature offers it so generously, and I just want to pass it on. Yeah.
And so it's thank you for doing that. I am nourished by the photos that you share. I followed your trip to Iceland with awe and wonder,
Yeah.
and you helped me visit there, though I haven't ever been there,
Mhm. Yeah.
and Nova Scotia as well. And I've noticed, it's like, so we live in different parts of this beautiful planet, this beautiful, challenged, changing,
Mhm.
morphine Gaia, and to give each other glimpses into that is so powerful. And so here I am in a place that never snows,
Mhm.
and yet I could follow along with you your journey through the seasons and the
Mhm.
thawing out of your lands and the melting of your snows and the sparkle of the water on your creeks with the snow around, and could be
Mhm.
reminded of that in a deep kind of a way of as a child of this earth, that I remember what that is, even though I haven't been exactly where you are in that moment, that there's an, a recognition.
Mhm.
And when you share with intention like that, when you've taken the time to slow yourself down to find that frame, that you are also, you can even hear my voice is slowing down, and just feeling that you
Mhm.
provide that opportunity.
Yeah, I hope so. Um, and the other thing that I just want to pick up on something you were saying earlier about indigenous people and the
Mm,
connection to the land and how that's been severed for so many of us
mm.
settlers, who came at different times to the Americas. Um,
And who are our ancestors, like, we have threads from various different places. We can't even really go back home
no,
because there's more than one home.
right. So somehow I was aware of that early in my childhood. Again, I knew
Mm, mm,
that there had been indigenous people on that place and that there weren't any anymore. That they weren't there, but they had been. I knew that very young, and I've
mm,
always been interested in connecting. Um, but what I do with people now with their memoirs is something I call ancestral archaeology.
mm,
And I think this is an important practice to try to go back through the generations, sometimes using imagination if you don't know the facts, but to try to go deeper into where we come from and what were the joys and the sorrows, the challenges and the resilience that those ancestors passed down to us, because we are all survivors. We stand on the shoulders of countless generations of survivors. And so to try to connect with those folks, whoever they are, and think more intentionally, well, what is it that I want to pass on to future generations? And what is no longer serving any purpose? What can I let go?
Wow. And so just realizing we're in a chain, I'm envisioning or perceiving a hand held backwards and a hand held forwards, and we're holding hands in our line of ancestors. And so important. I want to just absorb this for a moment. You're talking about intuiting and researching whatever combination you're able to accomplish, whether it's actually going back through records, asking questions, looking at old photographs, digging, finding, or even just feeling and imagining, honoring, bringing forward which deserves to be brought forward, but then also recognizing we also have a responsibility to let go of what shouldn't be passed along. And that somehow, and I feel like Estrella is out there saying, that there's this constant wheel of turning of what we continue forward with and what we let go of. And the more intention and awareness that we can bring to that act, the more opportunities there are for the utopian future.
Yeah. And it's not, it's not only about DNA kind of inheritance. I think we have spiritual lineages that we can tap into, and sort of the kind of history of ideas, the ideas that have mattered to our ancestors, the connections we make with, people that maybe we've only read their books, and I actually think that writing, write, that's one of the reasons to write at all, is because you can far outlive your own lifetime and connect with people in the future. And so again, how do you want to connect with the future?
That's so true. I'm just thinking, you were talking about the Caribbean. So I read Wide Sargasso Sea as a teenager, but before that I read Jane Eyre, and so the storyline of those two stories are connected, and how, me, kid in Denver, Colorado, was drinking this storyline or these storylines in, and that's then becoming a part of who I am, even though I had never been, well, I had been to England, but my point being, these are not places that I inhabited, but yet somehow they do become a part of us, don't they? The stories.
Yes, they do.
And the amazing immediacy of connection between the author and the reader, the intimacy of that connection, and how in our time now we actually can have a two-way connection, whereas Charlotte Bronte, Emily Bronte, they're not going to know Christine Beauchamp, right? But Jennifer Brody can know Christine Beauchamp, in terms of the author-reader relationship. And do you think that the authors who wrote on traditional printed material have a sensation of connection to their readership somehow?
You mean, 19th century authors or whatever?
Yeah. Like, is there some kind of like a spiritual connection there, an awareness on some level?
Well, I don't know. I'm not sure. There have been cases of authors from the past communicating with the present through mediumship. That
right,
does.
Right.
Yeah. But I think authors from the past, like for instance, one of the authors that I have spent a lot of time with is Mary Shelley with Frankenstein, because I have had to teach Frankenstein for many years. Mary Shelley, it's interesting that she felt herself to be kind of inferior to the men around her. She surrounded herself with the famous romantic poets. They all went on to be famous romantic poets.
Right.
Mary Shelley, we wouldn't remember her at all, except that she was the only one of her group who actually wrote the ghost story that they started to tell each other, one night. She went on and finished that book, and she published it, and it has never been out of print since she published it. It's one of the few books that's never ever been out of print.
That's
It's
remarkable. I
much,
didn't know that.
yeah, it's much more famous than Percy Shelley and the other
Right,
men.
right.
It's not only more famous, but it's been more influential in terms of sort of pop culture. Everybody knows Frankenstein. Everybody has an
Well,
idea.
everybody knows Frankenstein, but in the kind of way that we also know those pumpkin shaped plastic orange trick or treat baskets.
Yeah.
And to think about, for those of us who've actually had the privilege of reading Frankenstein,
Mhm. Mhm.
the the soul wrenching loneliness,
Oh, absolutely.
the
Yeah.
cobbling together of oneself from dead material, the relationship of creator and created, and I mean, there's just so much there that I think speaks on a visceral level to the soul, and that hopefully more people will actually know
Yeah.
the
I think it's
story.
been. I've been really happy to share that story with generations of college students. Um, and I think it has an important message about um, motherhood, fatherhood,
Mm.
responsibility for our creations, and it has an important environmental message for our time, I think.
And
And
so noticing that the alarm silently went off just now while we're talking
yeah.
about Frankenstein, and honoring your real world schedule of the day.
I have a
Would you?
few more.
Okay, because I was just wondering if we wanted to conclude our conversation by a little bit more delving into Frankenstein, or if we want to, if you in this
You.
interview have some other aspect you wanted to touch on.
About peace. Um, well, I wanted to pick up on. You just said something about utopia.
Yeah, so there's like the wheel of our responsibility in storytelling. Of You're talking about the ancestral archaeology, so we're going back, we're understanding what we can of our ancestors, we're understanding that we have a DNA lineage, and we also have an intellectual, emotional, spiritual lineage, and that they weave together, but they're not one and the same. And how
Mm-hmm.
ideas shape us. And as an adopted person, I am particularly curious
Mm-hmm.
and interested in this idea of the DNA lineage, and what comes from our surroundings and our nurturing. And then we've got Mary Shelley and Frankenstein, and the analogy of the parent and the creator, and how do we protect our creation? How do we allow our creation to find its own way in the world? And I'm thinking, how as a community do we then embrace the tender and the awkward and the different?
Mm-hmm.
How do we embrace and protect and cherish rather than shun and ostracize and be afraid of? I, but I sparked something for you when I was talking about that wheel of imagining being able to grasp that potential utopia through the remembering of what we want to bring forward, and the letting go of what we do not want to. We're taking the responsibility of not passing forward. So,
Right. So another technique of purposeful memoir that I have developed is based on alchemy and the alchemical practice of transmutation. So and that has to do with, I noticed as I began teaching memoir workshops for adults that very often people will immediately leap to the challenges they faced in life. And so you ask them,
ah,
tell your life
yeah,
story. That's what they think about.
yeah.
So I wanted to flip that script and ask them to think about the positive first. So think about what good things have happened in these different stages of your life first, and then think about the challenges. Sure, we need to come to grips with those, um, but also to give yourself permission, and this is a kind of lighthearted permission to transmute those challenges through a little bit of fiction. So here we are in memoir, nonfiction, but we can take a particular incident that's been troubling us, that's been heavy on our hearts all these years,
Yeah.
and say, well, what if? What if it had happened differently? What if I had known then what I know now? What if
Retell the
I had been
story.
able to say at that moment? Yeah, and retell the story. So we transmute it, and often when people do this, they suddenly see the incident differently and are able to get some life lessons that they can use, and that are so worth passing down, passing forward. A lot of
I
times
am
with memoir,
sorry,
go ahead.
I'm absolutely delighted with this, like, because I have also intuited that this is a powerful healing tool. The retelling, that we're not stuck with the truth of what physically happened.
Mm-hmm.
There's a heart truth. There's a
Yes,
heart truth that we can find by retelling the story. And that somehow that, you at 8 years old said, I don't know how we can save this forest. But if you were to go back through those chapters you had already written and take a different turn and
right.
and rework, reweave the missteps, that all of a sudden the pathway expands. And
That's right.
and in this purposeful memoir telling, you're showing people, hey, you don't have to be you don't have to stop with that magical retelling and understanding of your storyline at age 8. You are allowed to continue that into your adult life. And in fact, please,
That's right.
please continue that into your adult life.
Yeah, it's something about reaching back to your younger self and saying, um, you did, with tenderness, with compassion,
Mm,
with
mm,
understanding. Like you couldn't handle it then. You didn't know then what you know now.
mm.
But let me help you with that now. You
And so
know.
you weave back, right? You weave back and you pull forward that little
Hmm.
self with more tools than were available at the time.
Yes. And so one thing that I have recently learned about and have embraced is something called the Throughtopia. I
Oh,
just want to
wow. The
maybe end with
Throughtopia.
mentioning that. Yeah.
Yeah.
So there's the dystopia and the utopia, which are polarities, and
Yeah.
then there's the throughtopia, which is trying to imagine a way through to
Yeah.
the thriving future that we wish for.
Which is
So
the acceptance of the marriage, of the combining of the alchemy of the polarities,
yeah,
which allows
yeah,
the through path.
yeah. So that's really what I'm starting to focus more on now in my teaching, my writing, is just opening up opportunities for people to think collaboratively about finding our way through to a better way of relating to this beautiful world of ours. Yeah.
Mm. Mm. Wow, I actually really love that as a way to wrap this up.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that's one of the things I've learned in the time. Like, so I when I wrote this peace wall, or when I put this peace wall together, there's rise above polarities. But that
Mm.
was 2017, and I've come to understand since then that it's really more of a melding together of polarities, of emerging
Mm-hmm.
and going upward and also downward and sideways, and bringing together of polarities that then does create that
Yeah.
through path possibility.
Yeah. So that's transmuting. Yeah.
Transmuting,
Yeah.
transmuting.
Melding. Mm-hmm.
So, wow, we've expanded our list of verbs today. Thank you so much, Jennifer.
My pleasure. Yeah.